They thought they were here to inherit a fortune. I came to shatter that illusion. The waiting room at Harrison and Associates smelled like old oak and watered-down coffee, the kind of scent you'd expect in places where people came to fight over what others left behind. I arrived 15 minutes early, not out of nervousness, but because I wanted to see their faces the moment they walked in, still convinced they were about to become millionaires simply because they shared the Carter name. Michael came in first. Same confident stride, tailored Italian suit hair, slicked back a luxury watch gleaming on his wrist, like a constant reminder I was the chosen son. He looked at me the way one might look at a stain on leather, acknowledging it only enough to ignore it, then walked past without a word. Elizabeth followed, her perfume trailing behind in a sharp, sugary cloud. Silk dress clinging perfectly, heels tapping lightly on the floor. She didn't even glance in my direction, too busy lifting her phone to the light for a perfectly framed selfie. I could imagine the caption already drafted: "Big morning with the fam, dark legacy." Thomas arrived last 10 minutes late as usual, shirt wrinkled, coffee stain on his cuff, but his eyes, those were pure Michael, a blend of pity and condescension. Then came the voice of the receptionist, slicing clean through the air. "I'm sorry, the reading is for heirs only." I smiled. The line had been rehearsed. Not for me, but for those who assumed I no longer mattered. She spoke it gently, as if not to hurt feelings, but rejection always cuts no matter the tone. Michael smirked. "You know, Dad made his decision long ago, right, Sarah? Let's not make this morning harder than it needs to be." I stood, fastened the top button of my coat, and picked up my leather case. My voice was calm, measured. "I have an appointment with Mr. Harrison, 10 o'clock sharp." The conference room door swung open. James Harrison stepped out, his face briefly surprised to see me, before slipping into his usual professional expression. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Before we begin the reading, Ms. Carter has a few documents she'd like to present." Silence spread like frost. Elizabeth stopped typing. Michael's brow tightened. Thomas squinted. I walked past the threshold, leaving behind a room thick with confusion and barely disguised annoyance. They thought they were here to receive a legacy. I came to show them the truth. What they were waiting for was never theirs to begin with. Senu. Personal background 0, 32, 0. This wasn't revenge. I simply reclaimed what should never have been taken from me. They used to say I didn't belong in this family. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I wasn't like them. I didn't enjoy networking events. I didn't pose at ribbon cuttings. This wasn't revenge. I simply reclaimed what should never have been taken from me. They used to say I didn't belong in this family, not because I did anything wrong, but because I wasn't like them. I didn't enjoy networking events. I didn't pose at ribbon cuttings. I didn't know how to smile on cue when someone mentioned the word legacy. I was the only Carter who didn't know how to perform like a Carter. I once believed that if I stayed quiet enough, worked hard enough, became useful enough, my father might finally see my worth. But I was wrong. In his eyes, value didn't come from skill. It came from knowing your place. And my place was outside the frame. I still remember the day I applied for a job at Carter Holdings. I wasn't asking for a title, just a desk, a company email, and the chance to contribute. My father called back after exactly 43 seconds. His voice was flat, like reading off a memo. "Sarah, you're not a cultural fit. You overanalyze. You want to know when the plan started. The day I was rejected by the company that bore my own name. I rented a tiny office, more like a storage room, on the 3rd floor of a rundown building. The AC made a high-pitched whine. The paint was peeling. My desk was bought secondhand. But in that cramped, flickering space, I had something they didn't: freedom and data. I started monitoring the off-market real estate listings, the ones Carter Holdings was quietly offloading to keep cash flow afloat. My father would never admit failure, but numbers don't lie. Riverside Plaza sold fast to cover losses from a failed Dubai venture. I bought it through a shell company, Highland Partners. Maxwell Tower devalued after a management scandal. I secured the contract before they even reappraised, and so it continued. Piece by piece, the empire my father had built with blind pride slowly became mine. They thought I had vanished. I was simply buying back everything they were too proud to protect. I never complained. I was the only one without a portrait on the office wall, and yet now I own the wall itself. At a fundraising gala years ago, my father once said, "Sarah's not like the rest of us. She's cold, doesn't have the presence of a leader." I used to flinch at that line. But now when I signed the ownership deed for the building that once housed the Carter Holdings HQ, I only felt clarity. Cold, maybe, but precise. That coldness let me see what they refused to an empire crumbling from the inside. So today, when I walked into the law office and saw their faces wrinkle in surprise, they still saw me as the outsider. What they didn't know was for the past 4 years I'd been standing at the center, not under the spotlight, but with the blueprint in my hand. I didn't come here to reclaim my place in the family. I came to remind them that everything they believed was still theirs has quietly been mine all along. 3. The reveal, the quiet coup, 2004. The story they thought ended with our father's death was only just beginning, and I was the chapter they never saw coming. I placed my leather briefcase on the mahogany conference table, right in the room where million-dollar decisions were once made. Each of them sat across from me like they were watching a play, unaware that I was the one who wrote the script. "Before we get to the will," I said calmly, "I think it's important everyone understands there won't be much left to divide." Michael leaned forward. "What is that supposed to mean?" I opened the case and pulled out several thick files tabbed, indexed, notarized, signed, photocopied, and even included originals. I didn't speak for a few seconds. I let the sound of shuffling paper say it all. Then I began. "These are the ownership documents for Riverside Plaza," I said, sliding the file toward Michael. "Transferred in the 2nd year after the Dubai investment collapse. Purchased by Highland Investment Partners." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? I smiled. "It's one of my shell companies." Elizabeth stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "What are you doing?" "That's family property." "Was family property," I corrected, "until your father sold it." "Voluntarily, with a full signature. I just happened to offer the best price." Thomas flipped through one of the folders, his face draining of color. "Maxwell Tower. That's yours too. Through Summit Enterprises." I nodded. "And Carter East Wing, and Highland Shopping Center, and 5 industrial lots your company planned to develop into a logistics chain. Altogether as verified by Mr. Harrison's law firm." I turned to the lawyer, who gave a quiet nod. "I now legally own 85% of the assets you thought belonged to the family." Silence fell like the power had been cut. Michael pulled out his phone and began typing, probably messaging his personal attorney, or more likely the group chat he and Elizabeth used to coordinate family strategy. "You're welcome to verify everything I said. Every deal is on public record, sold at market rate with tax filings and registration to match. The only reason no one noticed is because none of you ever looked." Elizabeth murmured, lost. "But why didn't Dad say anything?" I paused. He knew. 2 weeks before he passed, I met with him, gave him everything, every document. You know what he said? I let the moment stretch. All eyes lifted. "You've been playing a game of chess, and I never realized I was just a pawn. And 5 industrial lots your company planned to develop into a logistics chain. Altogether as verified by Mr. Harrison's law firm." I turned to the lawyer, who gave a quiet nod. "I now legally own 85% of the assets you thought belonged to the family." Silence fell like the power had been cut. Michael pulled out his phone and began typing, probably messaging his personal attorney, or more likely the group chat he and Elizabeth used to coordinate family strategy. "You're welcome to verify everything I said. Every deal is on public record, sold at market rate with tax filings and registration to match. The only reason no one noticed is because none of you ever looked." Elizabeth murmured, lost. "But why didn't Dad say anything?" I paused. He knew. 2 weeks before he passed, I met with him, gave him everything, every document. You know what he said? I let the moment stretch. All eyes lifted. "You've been playing a game of chess, and I never realized I was just a pawn." I pulled out a scanned copy of a handwritten note. Then he signed a document relinquishing his name from the last remaining holdings. voluntarily, after realizing every wrong move he made was already calculated into my plan. Michael exploded. You manipulated him, took advantage while he was sick, forced him into this. He was sharp enough to deny you, I said evenly. He signed a full transfer of control over the remaining assets, not because he was tricked, but because he finally saw it all. Thomas buried his head in his hands. Elizabeth wept silently. Michael stared, muttering like he was glitching. This isn't possible. You were the one cut off from the family." I looked at them, not angry, not smug, just honest. While you were too busy looking up counting tower floors, Forbes articles, and follower counts, you never noticed the ground shifting beneath you. I didn't break into an empire. I bought it, piece by piece, legally, strategically, quietly. Mr. Harrison rested his hand on the folder holding the will. I think now would be the time to read the rest, but I already knew for them it didn't matter anymore. The reveal had already happened, and I was the one rewriting the entire board. Some apologies come too late to fix anything, but just in time to heal something that never stopped hurting. Mr. Harrison rested his hand gently on the final stack of papers, his eyes distant, as though he'd witnessed too many families fracture in silence over things no one ever dared to say aloud. The room waited breathless, thick with the weight of what might finally be spoken. This is the final will and testament of Mr. Jonathan Carter. He began duly signed, notarized, and recorded. The remaining assets will be distributed as follows. I didn't flinch when he mentioned them, Michael, Elizabeth, and Thomas inheriting what was left a gutted management company, a few scattered properties, the remnants of a name they'd clung to more than they'd ever nurtured. Nothing anyone truly wanted, but still something they would have fought over, until today. Then he said my name, to my daughter Sarah Carter. A knot rose in my throat, sudden, unexpected. I had believed I had let this family go long ago, that I had nothing left to want from them. But hearing my name read from my father's will, the same man who once told me I didn't belong, made something shift inside me. Because somewhere deep down, a small part of me had still been waiting to be seen. I left my private art collection, along with a handwritten letter which he requested be read aloud. I gave a slight nod. My hands were cold. My heart slowed like I was stepping back into a memory I had locked away years ago. Mr. Harrison unfolded the letter. But there was still one final paragraph I hadn't written, one that didn't come from me but from him. He never said those words while he was alive. Not at a dinner, not over the phone. He saved them for the page, as if only in death could he strip away the pride and speak plainly. And I understood. His ego had always been towering, but apparently, so was his love. I didn't cry. But something inside me softened, something that had stayed clenched for years. After everything I'd built without him, after all the deals and signatures, I realized I had still wanted to know that I hadn't been invisible to him. And now I did. He had seen me. Maybe always had. He just didn't know what to do with a daughter who proved him wrong, brilliantly, irrevocably. So he chose silence. And now finally chose honesty, too late for repair, but just in time for release. And strangely, that was enough. I stood up without a word. But there was still one final paragraph I hadn't written, one that didn't come from me, but from him. He never said those words while he was alive. Not at a dinner, not over the phone. He saved them for the page, as if only in death could he strip away the pride and speak plainly. And I understood. His ego had always been towering. But apparently, so was his love. I didn't cry, but something inside me softened, something that had stayed clenched for years. After everything I'd built without him, after all the deals and signatures, I realized I had still wanted to know that I hadn't been invisible to him. And now I did. He had seen me, maybe always had. He just didn't know what to do with a daughter who proved him wrong, brilliantly, irrevocably. So he chose silence. And now finally I chose honesty, too late for repair, but just in time for release. And strangely, that was enough. I stood up without a word. The letter lay on the table untouched. I didn't need to carry it with me. It was no longer a weight. It was closure, quiet, unspectacular, but real. As I walked out of the room, no one stopped me. No one called my name. And for the first time in years, I felt light. Not because I'd been recognized, but because I finally knew I no longer needed it. I didn't come back to reclaim my place in the family. I came back to redefine it on my own terms. The air in the room still hung heavy as I finally lifted my gaze. They avoided my eyes like I held a sentence in my hands, but I didn't. I only had an offer, not a surrender, not a victory, a beginning. I will retain full control of all assets, I said, voice calm but immovable. There will be no division, no co-ownership, no negotiations. Michael shifted in his seat, ready to object, but I raised a hand. However, the room stilled. I won't throw any of you out of the system I rebuilt from the rubble you left behind. Instead, I'm offering a choice. I opened my case and pulled out 3 contracts, each placed neatly in front of them. Entry-level positions, no special treatment, no priority. You'll start from the bottom, the same way I once did, with unread reports, uninvited meetings, work done in silence while others took the credit. Thomas stared at me in disbelief. Elizabeth swallowed hard, trying to remain composed. Michael flushed but said nothing because deep down he knew there were no other doors left open. I'm not seeking revenge, I said, my voice softer now, because I don't need it. What I want isn't to prove who was wrong, it's to build something where no one has to be invisible just so someone else can shine. I stood, taking nothing with me but the quiet I'd earned. The final letter from my father still lay open on the table, its trembling script a reflection of all the things he never said aloud. You don't need what I left behind. You were the only one who knew how to build it from scratch. I walked out of the office. The heavy wooden door closed behind me without a single voice calling after. My footsteps echoed lightly against the marble hallway, no longer burdened by anger or grief. As I pushed open the door, midday sunlight fell across my shoulders, warm enough to remind me that not every ending needs to feel like a triumph. Sometimes clarity is enough, and sometimes forgiveness doesn't come through words. It comes through the choice to keep something intact or to let it go. I chose to keep it, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved to do it. They wrote me out of the story. I didn't fight for a role, I wrote a better one.